Hello, I'm Professor Clare Saunders and I'm a Professor in Environmental Politics on the Penryn Campus of the University of Exeter. What I'm going to talk to you about today is the process and the results of a survey of Extinction Rebellion activists that was published by the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity with Graham Hayes and Brian Doherty from the Universities of Keele and Aston respectively. Now, this report made a real splash in the media. We ended up with coverage in the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the New Scientist and the Tatler magazine. But perhaps the biggest highlight of my career was this. This is a tweet from Leonardo DiCaprio, who's quoting me saying that for the first time we're seeing ordinary people being involved in environmental direct action. Now, lots of things get published in the media, sometimes on the basis of quite circumspect survey evidence. Should we believe our survey results just because they receive such a big media splash? I think it's right to take caution, and we should always take survey data that we see in the media with some level of scepticism. But we're actually quite positive that we have a good sample here, and I want to tell you about how we became positive about that. But first off, I just want to illustrate one of the problems around bias in terms of sampling. Now, if I have a class of 50 students completing course evaluation questionnaires and only 4 of them reply and 2 of them give me negative results, that means it looks like 50% of my students are dissatisfied with my course. And of course, I am knowledgeable enough to realise that that doesn't mean that 50% of the whole class are dissatisfied with my teaching, because we know that students who are aggrieved are more likely to reply. But this really does illustrate the importance of trying to have a representative sample. There are 2 problems, I think, with protest surveying in terms of the sampling. The first one is in relation to selection bias. In 2005, I did one of my first protest surveys. I took a group of students to the G8 demonstrations, the Make Poverty History demonstrations in Edinburgh, and they were instructed to randomly select people to interview. And what happened was, we actually noticed that there was a very particular demographic that they were targeting. One of the male students seemed to want to always target women. But usually people were targeting people with a similar demographic to themselves rather than doing this randomly. Selection bias is something we need to avoid. A second problem is response rate bias. So if we go to a protest armed with mailback surveys with free post envelopes, we hand them out, we have a problem in that not everybody replies. And we know that the people who reply tend to be the people who are better educated, more politically interested, and they also tend to be older and not younger people. So that means we don't necessarily have a really good sample from mailback surveys unless we take measures to address it. In 2009, I started working on a project called Caught in the Act of Protest with a bunch of European scholars. And we devised some methods to try to make sure we could systematically sample protesters without having these problems of selection bias and response rate bias. How did we do that? First off, we avoided selection bias by making sure that our team of volunteer students were supervised by a field worker who we called a pointer. What we would do would be to estimate the size of the demonstration. We would take 1,000 printed surveys and we would try to hand them out, one in every so many people, depending on the size of the demo. So, for example, if we estimated 52,000 people on a demonstration, we would make sure that we were giving one survey to 1 in every 52 people, and that was systematically counted, and try to be as accurate as possible in doing so. The second problem is harder to solve, and that's around response rate bias. So only between 10 and 40% of people respond when they're given a mailback survey. So how have we addressed this? Well, what we've done is created a very clever methodology. Here's an example of a survey that we've used before. So every mailback survey that we hand out has a number on it, and 1 in every 5 of them have inside a short face-to-face interview that has a match number on it. So this one is number 20. The booklet's also marked number 20. What we can then do is see who is responding and who isn't. What we do, because we've conducted the interview randomly, we assume that the people who do the interview constitute a random sample of people on the march. The survey booklet is not answered by everybody. Because it's match number, we can see who isn't answering it. So we have two subsamples. We have the people who are interviewed, and then we have the people who are interviewed and respond to the survey, who we assume are representative of everybody who responds to the survey, and we can work out where the response rate biases are. So how did this work in terms of our Extinction Rebellion survey? Well, we actually modified this method and used an online survey instead of a paper survey. We did only have 16% of people responding to the survey. Do I hear alarm bells ringing? Well, maybe I do, but I don't think we need to worry, because the questions in the short interview and the questions in the long booklet indicated to us that we had very few problems with our sampling. Actually, remarkably so, much more so than usual on a protest survey, the samples were quite evenly matched, apart from on one variable, which was age. Basically, the younger people weren't responding to our survey. So when I present to you age demographics, I'm going to be presenting to you the age that comes from what we know is the more representative sample, which is the interview sample, which we know 94% of those approached answered. So what did we find out about who Extinction Rebellion activists are? First off, we found out that they're not stalwarts. They are not people who've been routinely going to lots and lots and lots of demonstrations that have become disillusioned and then turned to civil disobedience. 75% of them had participated in fewer than 10 demonstrations in their life. And that might sound like a lot of demonstrations for a young person, but even when we look just at the age data from the interview, which we know is pretty representative, we find that their mean age is 41. We've seen that there are groups of retired civil disobedience activists as well as groups of youngsters as well. They're also 60% female. They mostly self-identified as middle class, as being from the lower or upper middle class. We noted, rather than asked them in a survey, that they were mostly white. They were also mostly from southern English towns, and quite shockingly, over 87% of them had a degree. So what does this tell us? Well, this tells us that they're actually a very respectable bunch, which I think should give the movement some credibility. Extinction Rebellion might berate itself a little bit for not being able to reach out to broader demographics, but I think it should give itself a big pat on the back for reaching this very respectable bunch of people who engage in its actions. If we go back to the 1990s, environmental activists were drawn from subcultures of disaffected youths. So to have a much higher mean age of activists and groups from different areas of society who are undoubtedly respectable and middle class is a very, very good thing for Extinction Rebellion. I just also want to mention that this kind of research links into my teaching. So basically I take groups of students with me who form the protest survey volunteers and watch this space for further updates on the UK protest scene. Once COVID is over, we'll be back out on the streets in force alongside the protesters. So I hope to have convinced you that the demographic that we've looked at in Extinction Rebellion represents the people on the Extinction Rebellions, not just an artefact of our survey methodology. Thank you for listening.